We had a file on them. 43 pages. Translated from a third-party survey conducted 200 years ago by a Vethrani cartography drone that spent 11 minutes in low orbit before its collision avoidance system decided the planet wasn't worth the fuel risk and rerouted itself home. 43 pages. Most of it atmospheric data. A paragraph on bipedal fauna. One line, one flagged under behavioral assessment, subjects demonstrate rudimentary tool use and localized tribal conflict. Threat classification, negligible. Recommended status, primitive world, non-contact pending resource viability review. Negligible. I have read that word approximately 217 times in the past 6 weeks. I have read it standing in rubble. I have read it with 3 of my officers dead and a 4th one crying into her communicator in a language I do not speak. I have read it while one single human, held a position against 11 of us for 42 minutes using nothing but a broken piece of our own equipment and what I can only describe as personal offense. Negligible. I keep the file open on my secondary screen. Not because it is useful. Because someone needs to witness how catastrophically, spectacularly, almost impressively wrong we were. This is that witness account. I am writing it mostly because I cannot sleep. And also because if I don't write it down, I'm not sure anyone will believe me. And also, if I'm being completely honest, which my therapist says I should try, because I am still not entirely sure the war is over. The humans haven't said it's over. That worries me more than anything else in the file. My name is Assessor Rank Ven Solaris of the Galactic Compact Survey Division, 3rd Expansion Arm, and I am writing this log entry in the supply closet of what used to be our forward operations post on a continent the humans call Eastern Europe, which is a geographical designation that means nothing to me and apparently means something different to every human I have asked. The closet smells like something the humans brew and drink on purpose. They call it coffee. It smells like scorched grain and regret. I have been living in this closet for 6 days because the main operations room has a window, and windows feel irresponsible right now. I should explain. 4 months ago, the Compact Survey Division assigned me to lead the Preliminary Integration Assessment of Earth, designation UX 7734, Third Planet, Sol System, Orion Cygnus Arm, formerly classified as Primitive World since the Vethrani flyby 2 centuries prior. Integration assessments are, traditionally, paperwork. You arrive. You observe. You document the cultural baseline, economic capacity, technological ceiling, and estimated timeline to compact eligibility. You file your report. You go home. The planet gets flagged for potential contact in 50 to 200 years, depending on how quickly it's developing. Nobody gets hurt. Nobody even raises their voice. I had done 14 of them. I was good at them. My assessments were known for their thoroughness, their clarity, and their structural elegance. Assessment Director Therick once described my work as the gold standard of preliminary documentation, and I had the commendation plaque to prove it. I had been looking forward to Earth in a dim, professionally satisfied way. 43 pages of existing data. A primitive world. 11 months of field observation, mostly remote, maybe 2 or 3 surface passes in a massed survey vehicle. A clean write-up. A quiet retirement milestone. I had told my partner I would be home before the cold season. I have not been home. The first thing I documented about Earth was that it was louder than the file suggested. I don't mean that metaphorically. The Vethrani drone had recorded ambient noise data, and I had calibrated my expectations accordingly. But the drone had spent 11 minutes in orbit. It had not been inside a city. I was. We had set our primary observation post in a dense urban zone, a city called Warsaw, which the humans built, then destroyed, then built again, twice, in living memory. That detail was in the historical database but had registered to me as simple data. Primitive worlds had localized conflicts. This was known. I had filed that note the same way I filed atmospheric particulate counts. Standing in Warsaw in the early morning, watching the city move, I understood it differently. The noise was constant and layered. Ground vehicles, voices, music bleeding from buildings, construction at 5 separate sites I could see from the observation window. The humans moved fast. Not fast the way prey animals move, not erratic. Fast the way water moves, finding routes, filling gaps, adjusting without stopping. A delivery operator on a two-wheeled vehicle weaved between slower traffic with a calm so complete it looked like indifference to consequences. A woman walking 3 different animals on 3 different lead lengths managed all of them with one hand while looking at a small screen in the other. My field assistant, a young officer named Preth, was stationed beside me. He had never done a surface observation before. He kept making small sounds. Not words. Just small involuntary sounds of mild overwhelm. Log it, I told him. Log what specifically? All of it. I poured myself something from the thermal unit. Not coffee. I had not yet encountered coffee. We're here to observe. Observe. He observed. After approximately 4 minutes he said, quietly, there are a lot of them. There were 8 billion, give or take. The Vethrani file had recorded population estimates but, again, data registers differently than presence. You can know a number. Standing in Warsaw watching the density of a single city block, you feel the number. I noted it. Filed it under Population Density Assessment, Urban Classification. Did not think much more about it. That was my first mistake. There were others. The second thing I documented about Earth was that the humans had been in a war. Not currently, technically, the major formal conflicts had ended within the previous century, though ended applied loosely and, selectively, but, the infrastructure of the wars was everywhere. Monuments. Preserved ruins. Museums. A particular quality of attention in the older humans when certain topics arose in the ambient conversation I was intercepting and, translating through my field kit. The memory of it was architectural. It was in the shape of the streets. Warsaw had been razed to rubble and rebuilt not once but twice inside a single generation. The humans who rebuilt it had done so from photographs. From memory. From what their parents told them it had looked like. I documented this. I filed it under Cultural Resilience Indicators, Moderate. Moderate. I look at that designation now and I don't know. Something undignified. Preth would say I should throw the file across the room, which is what Preth does with things that frustrate him. I have more restraint than Preth. I just stare at it and drink the terrible coffee I have since become chemically dependent on. Moderate resilience. As if I had been watching them rebuild a garden shed. The third thing I documented about Earth, the thing that should have recalibrated everything and didn't, because I was a fool in a supply closet who had never been wrong about a primitive world assessment before, was one specific human. I will call her Subject 17 in this log, because I did not yet know her name, and also because giving her a name in the official record feels like something I need to earn the right to do, given how badly I misread her. Subject 17 was a soldier. Not actively deployed at the time of initial observation, she was between assignments, attending what the humans call a training rotation. A professional development exercise. Soldiers going through drills not because they were preparing for a specific conflict but because maintaining the skill set was the job. I observed the training rotation for 3 days from a masked surveillance position. On the first day, 17 failed a timed obstacle course. She failed it badly. She fell twice, missed a timing window on the upper section, and came in significantly outside the acceptable benchmark. The training supervisor, I had approximately 40 words of the local language at this point, enough to catch tone and numbers, was not gentle in the debrief. I documented, subjects demonstrate variable physical performance. Some individuals show notable limitation under assessment conditions. Subnote, Subject 17 appears to represent lower performance tier. On the second day, 17 ran the course again. Same obstacles. Same benchmark. She failed again, less badly, but still outside the window. I updated the note, repeated failure suggests ceiling limitation. Subject 17 reclassified as performance baseline reference, not exceptional sample. On the third day, she got up an hour before the rest of the rotation. I know this because I was running passive surveillance on the facility overnight and my system flagged motion in the pre-dawn dark. She ran the obstacle course alone. No supervisor. No audience. Just the course and her and the dark and a small timing device she'd strapped to her wrist. She failed 4 times before she got it right. And, when she got it right, I replayed this segment more than I care to admit. She didn't celebrate. She didn't raise her arms. She stood still for approximately 3 seconds. Then, she reset to the start position and ran it again. I did not update my documentation. I don't know why. Professional stubbornness, perhaps. I had already classified her. The data felt settled. That was my second mistake, and it was worse than the first. The assignment was supposed to be observation only. I want to be very clear about this. The assessment directive was explicit: remote observation, minimal surface exposure, no contact, no interference with local development trajectory. Standard protocol for primitive world evaluation. At no point was I supposed to be standing in a collapsed building in Warsaw at 2 a.m. with 3 of my officers, trying to figure out how a single human had gotten behind us. But that requires context I don't have space for yet. What I can tell you is how the directive changed. 6 weeks into the assessment, Compact Command sent a secondary priority flag. Not unusual, field assessments get amended. It arrived in my standard briefing queue, tagged low urgency, informational. I read it the way I read most low urgency dispatches, which is to say I read it while doing something else. The flag was a courtesy notification. A Compact Resources survey vessel, not mine, a different division, had completed preliminary mineral analysis on Earth and flagged several significant subsurface deposits. Rare composites. The kind that shortcut certain manufacturing processes by decades. The deposits were deep. Extraction would require significant infrastructure and, the survey vessel had noted, the clearing of a substantial inhabited zone. The Resources Division had filed a potential acquisition interest notation and forwarded it to the Integration Assessment Track, my track, with a request for timeline acceleration. In compact bureaucratic language, timeline acceleration means, can we speed up the classification process so the resource extraction permitting can begin? The inhabited zone in question was approximately 3 million humans. I remember setting down my coffee. I had found coffee by this point. I was already beginning to understand its particular comfort and staring at the notification for a very long time. 3 million. The Compact had clear ethical guidelines about populated world extraction. I knew the guidelines. I had filed assessments that referenced them. The guidelines existed. They were real. They also had exceptions for worlds below a defined development threshold. Primitive world classification qualified. I filed an immediate query back to command. I noted the population figure. I requested clarification on the ethical review status. I used the word concerns once, in a carefully constructed sentence, the way you use words when you work for a bureaucracy and want to say this is wrong without actually saying it in writing. Command responded in 4 hours. The ethical review was ongoing. The potential acquisition interest was non-binding at this stage. I should continue my assessment on the accelerated timeline and submit my findings within 30 days instead of the original 11 months. I stared at that response for a long time too. Then, I poured more coffee and did something I had never done in 14 assessments. I went back and read all 43 pages of the Vethrani file again. Slowly. Looking for what I had missed. I found a lot. The Vethrani file, written 200 years ago by a drone that spent 11 minutes in orbit, contained almost nothing about how humans actually worked. It had population data. Atmospheric chemistry. Some surface topology. A note about tool use. A note about tribal conflict. It did not contain the fact that humans had been in continuous large-scale collective conflict for essentially the entirety of their recorded history and had survived it every time. It did not contain the fact that they had developed, within the past 200 years alone, technologies for mass destruction so thorough that the primary reason they hadn't destroyed themselves with those technologies was an ongoing collective agreement not to, held together by nothing more than the understanding of mutual consequence. It did not contain the fact that their military structures were among the most technically sophisticated I had encountered in 14 assessments of worlds the Compact had classified as primitive. That their weapons were not ceremonial. That their soldiers trained not for ritual but for genuine organized violence, continuously, professionally, with remarkable efficiency. It did not contain Subject 17, alone in the pre-dawn dark, failing an obstacle course for the fourth time and resetting to the start. I had 30 days to submit findings that would determine whether 3 million humans were classified as an acceptable casualty threshold for mineral extraction. I went back to the training facility. Preth thought I was losing my professional detachment. "You've reviewed Subject 17's files 11 times, he said, not accusatory, just noting it. He notes things. That's actually his best quality as a field officer, he notices without immediately judging. I'm building a composite behavioral profile. For one subject. Representative sample of larger patterns." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, do you want me to note that in the log?" "Note whatever you think is accurate." He didn't note it. Which means Preth also had concerns he didn't want in writing. We understood each other, Preth and I. What I was doing, and I can say this now, though I couldn't quite say it at the time, was looking for a reason. A justifiable, professional, documented reason to classify Earth differently. To push the development threshold up. To give command something that would stall the resource extraction review. I was not supposed to be doing this. An assessor's job is observation, not advocacy. The findings go where the findings go. But I was watching Subject 17 in the training rotation, and I was thinking about 3 million humans, and I was thinking about Warsaw rebuilt twice from rubble and from memory, and I was doing the thing that my assessment director Therick would have called a compromise of professional integrity and that I was calling something else in my head. I was calling it paying attention. On the 22nd day of the accelerated timeline, our surveillance was compromised. I say compromised. What I mean is that Subject 17 found the surveillance drone. Not by accident. By method. She had noticed. I went back through the footage later, looking for when exactly she had noticed the drone approximately 9 days prior. A single flicker of eye contact. Not long. Not pointed. The kind of look you give something that doesn't fit and, then, file away to return to when you have more information. 9 days of continuing her normal activity while, as became apparent, constructing a systematic picture of the drone's patrol patterns. On day 22 she shot it out of the air with a modified training weapon and a patience that, in retrospect, I should have recognized as a personality trait and not a coincidence. The drone was masked. She shouldn't have been able to see it. She had worked out its position from reflective microdistortions in the rain. I remember sitting in the observation post looking at the blank feed screen and feeling, for the first time in this assessment, something I do not have a good professional word for. The closest I can get is recalibration. Not fear. Not yet. But the particular feeling of a category changing in your head. Of a file that said 43 pages suddenly, suggesting there should have been 400. Preth was very quiet beside me. Then, he said, "Should we relocate?" "Yes," I said. "Yes, I think so." We relocated. We set up the secondary observation post. We tightened our masking signatures and adjusted to a higher altitude passive array. We were more careful. 17 was more careful too. Within 6 days she had identified the new array's position through a method I still don't fully understand involving the behavioral patterns of local birds, which, and I say this as someone who has documented 17 distinct intelligent species in 14 assessments, is not a thing any subject in my previous experience has ever done. She didn't shoot the array. She did something subtler. She started feeding it false behavioral data. Continuing her normal patterns at the times and locations she knew we were recording, while clearly conducting something else when we couldn't see her. I had been watching humans for 30 days. I had extensive data on how they moved, communicated, and organized. I thought I understood the pattern. She had been watching me, or watching the evidence of me, for most of that time. And she understood my pattern better than I understood hers. The assessor had become the assessed. I remember this moment very clearly. Not because of what it meant for the field mission, though it meant a great deal. I remember it because of what Preth said when we realized what she had done. He said, quietly, almost to himself, "She knew we were here." A pause. "She knew, and she let us think she didn't." Another pause. Then, he closed his field tablet, set it carefully on the table, and said, in a tone that was professional and precise and completely unable to hide the thing underneath it, "Assessor Solaris, I don't think this is a primitive world." I drank my coffee. I did not disagree. The 30-day deadline was in 4 days. I had a report to write. I had findings to submit. I had, technically speaking, sufficient observational data to file a preliminary assessment that would satisfy Command's accelerated timeline and move the resource extraction review forward. I had Subject 17's behavioral profile on one screen and the 3 million population notation on the other. I also had, and this is the part that does not appear in the official report, because some things you do for reasons that aren't bureaucratically defensible, a second file. Unofficial. Extensive. The file I had been building over 30 days, not as formal documentation but as the thing you build when you're trying to understand something and you know the standard category isn't right. 412 pages. Most of it about 17. Some of it about Warsaw. Some of it about a species that had been continuously destroying and rebuilding itself for recorded history and kept going anyway, not despite the destruction but somehow organized around it. Structured by it. Made, in some way I don't have the vocabulary for, more itself by the experience of surviving it. I sent the official preliminary findings to Command on day 30. I classified Earth's development threshold at a level that triggered automatic mandatory re-review. I cited 17 specific behavioral indicators that met or exceeded criteria for upward reclassification. I attached Subject 17's full behavioral analysis as Appendix D. It was, professionally speaking, the most aggressive positive reclassification I had ever submitted in 14 assessments. Assessment Director Therick would later describe it as anomalous. Command would later describe it as inconvenient. 17, if she ever read it, which she did not, because it was classified, because I am not supposed to exist as far as she is officially concerned, would probably have described it as late. She would have been right. I submitted the report. I poured more coffee. I stared at the supply closet wall. And then, Command sent back a response that was not what I expected, and the thing I was doing changed from assessment into something I did not have a word for yet. But that is part 2. Assessor Rank Ven Solaris Field Log Active Status Classification Restricted 3rd Expansion Arm Survey Division Note appended by Assessor Solaris. If you are reading this file and the resource extraction notation is still active, then I failed at something more important than the assessment. Read Appendix D, read it carefully. Then, ask yourself what negligible means to a species that rebuilt Warsaw from memory. Command's response arrived at 0340 local Warsaw time, which meant someone on the review board had been waiting for my filing. That detail bothered me more than it should have. Reviews at that hour meant the assessment had already attracted a level of institutional attention that preliminary reports don't normally earn. Someone had been watching this file. Not the way I had been watching Earth, not with 43 original pages and a methodical recalibration, but watching it the way you watch a process you want to complete quickly and quietly before anyone notices the implications. I read the response 3 times. Then, I got up and made more coffee, which I have since identified as my primary coping mechanism, though at the time I genuinely believed I was just cold. The response was polite. Compact bureaucratic language has a particular structure, formal, equidistant, built to say things without technically saying them. I had written in that structure for 15 years. I could read it like a secondary language. What the response said, technically, was, "Thank you for your preliminary findings. The reclassification threshold query has been forwarded to the Resources Evaluation Subcommittee for review. In the interim, on-site integration assessment activity should continue per standard protocol. What the response meant, in the secondary language underneath, your reclassification flag has been noted and routed to a committee that will sit on it indefinitely. Continue observation. Don't make this complicated. There was one additional line that did not fit the standard format. It said, Command notes that Appendix D may reflect assessor investment in subject profile beyond professional guidelines. This observation is logged as informal and non-disciplinary at this time. I stared at that line for a very long time. Then, I sent a reply, acknowledged. Appendix D reflects documented behavioral data, not assessor investment. Query: what is the current status of the population displacement threshold review? Their response came in 40 minutes. Under standard procedure, displacement threshold reviews occur following completion of full integration assessment and resource survey reconciliation. Current status: pending. Pending. 3 million people, and the answer was pending. Preth found me at the supply closet desk at 6 in the morning, still in the same position, surrounded by empty cups. He looked at the screen. He looked at me. He said nothing, which is something I respect about Preth. He knows when silence is the appropriate vocabulary. He made fresh coffee. He sat down across from me. And, he said, "What are we doing?" I should tell you what we meant in that context. The field team for a standard preliminary assessment is 4 officers, the lead assessor, a field documentation specialist, a cultural translation analyst, and a systems technician. Small, mobile, designed for quiet observation. Not equipped, staffed, or authorized for anything beyond remote documentation. My team was me, Preth, documentation, an analyst named Sevi who had joined us 3 weeks in after the original analyst developed a protein intolerance reaction to Earth's atmospheric particulate mix, and a technician called Ro who communicated primarily through technical annotations and had, at some point in the past week, also become chemically attached to the coffee. Ro had opinions about coffee quality that I found both excessive and, oddly, validating. When Preth asked what we were doing, he meant, the 4 of us, in a supply closet, with a pending designation on a population displacement review, and a human soldier who had identified and manipulated 2 separate surveillance systems using local bird behavior. What we were doing was not, technically, any of our jobs. Continuing the assessment, I said. Preth looked at me. He had the expression he got when he was deciding whether to note something in the log. The assessment, he said. The thorough assessment. The comprehensive behavioral profile. The kind of documentation that makes it extremely difficult to approve an extraction permit on accelerated timeline because the behavioral complexity data requires extended review. I drank my coffee. Standard protocol. Sevi, who had been pretending to organize field notes in the corner, said without looking up, "That's not what standard protocol means." I'm interpreting it broadly. That's not Sevi. She looked up. Do you want to be here when the displacement threshold gets approved, or do you want to still be building the file when it hits the review board? She looked at her field notes. She looked at me. She went back to organizing. Ro, without looking up from the technical console, said, "The new drone array will be online in 6 hours." I recalibrated the masking signature. She won't find this one using birds. A pause. Probably. We got back to work. The problem with extending an assessment that Command once concluded is that you need data. Real data. New behavioral indicators. Not things that could be dismissed as assessor bias or overinterpretation of existing observation. I needed Subject 17 to do something I could document objectively. The universe, which occasionally has a sense of timing, provided this within 48 hours in the form of a training scenario I had not anticipated and could not have designed better if I had tried. The military Unit 17 belonged to designation withheld from official logs. I've replaced it with Unit 7 throughout, was tasked with a field evaluation. Not a drill. An actual operational exercise, a simulated hostile extraction scenario, designed to test unit coordination and decision-making under conditions as close to genuine crisis as the training framework allowed. I observed from the newly recalibrated high-altitude array. The scenario, as I understood it from intercepted comm fragments and the translated briefing documents SEBI had managed to pull from a low-security training network, Unit 7 was to locate and extract a simulated asset from a designated area, under active opposition from a separate unit playing the role of a blocking force. Standard military exercise. I had seen variations of it in several previous assessments. Professionally organized societies run these exercises. It was, on paper, not exceptional. What was exceptional was what 17 did in the first 4 minutes. The standard approach to this kind of extraction is direct: move fast, maintain formation, use numerical advantage or firepower to clear the path. Unit 7 had the numerical advantage. The blocking force was smaller but held a favorable defensive position. 17 didn't take the direct path. She had been running the drill communication channels, and she had been listening to the blocking force's radio discipline, which was good, which is why I noted it, because the blocking force was also a professional unit and she had found a single word that appeared in their transmissions on a 3-minute rotation. Not a meaningful word. A check-in word. A confirmation that a designated position was still held. The word stopped appearing at the 4-minute mark. Not because 17 had done anything to the position. She had done nothing to it. What she had done was identify the communication pattern, calculate the rotation, figure out that a 3-minute check-in meant approximately 3 minutes of reaction window if something disrupted the chain, and then created a disruption not at the position but at the communication relay. She disrupted it. The check-in word didn't transmit. The blocking force's command structure spent 22 seconds in uncertainty, not long, not decisive on its own. 17 moved the unit through the position gap in 20 seconds. Asset extracted. Exercise complete. The blocking force commander, from intercepted audio, sounded genuinely annoyed. I watched 17 in the debrief. Not triumphant. Taking notes. Looking at what had almost gone wrong, not what had gone right. I had 400 pages on her. I added another 12 that afternoon. Then, I wrote a formal addendum to the preliminary report. I cited the exercise. I cited the communication analysis. I cited the 3-second observation of the masking drone that had led to 9 days of coordinated counter-surveillance. I used the word strategic 14 times, because the formal criteria for upward reclassification includes documented evidence of complex strategic cognition at population scale, and I needed that phrase in the administrative record. I transmitted the addendum to Command. Command's response came in 2 hours this time. Someone was definitely watching this file. The response said, "Addendum received." Note that single-subject behavioral profiles do not constitute population-scale evidence per Reclassification Protocol 7.2. Assessor Solaris is reminded that assessment objectivity standards require cross-sample verification before threshold adjustment. Cross-sample verification. I closed the message. I opened a new documentation file. I looked at Pref. "We're going to need more subjects," I said. What followed was the most intensive 3 weeks of field observation I had conducted in 15 years of assessments. Cross-sample verification, per Reclassification Protocol 7.2, requires documented behavioral evidence from a minimum of 12 distinct subjects across at least 3 separate demographic categories. I pulled the full Warsaw demographic survey, identified representative samples across age ranges, occupational sectors, and geographic subzones, and built systematic observation routes for each one. I slept approximately 4 hours a night. Rowe stopped making observations about coffee quality and started just making it preemptively, which I interpreted as concern and appreciated. What I found, across 12 subjects from 3 demographic categories in 3 weeks of intensive cross-sample observation, was something that I could not file neatly and did not fully understand and has not stopped occupying a specific corner of my thinking since. The humans were not exceptional in isolation. 17 was exceptional. That was observable, documented, not in dispute. But, what the cross-sample showed, what I kept finding in 12 different people in 12 different contexts, was not that the humans produced individual excellence in rare cases. It was that they were organized around it. Not officially. Not structurally. Not in any way the 43 original pages had flagged as a social architecture indicator. The Warsaw Street vendor who had been running the same corner location for 30 years and knew every regular by name and their preferences and their family situations and their rough financial state, that was not exceptional in a military sense. It was exceptional in a different sense. It was a node. A point of community cohesion that required sustained personal investment from one human over decades, held in place by nothing except that human's decision to keep doing it. The emergency response team that operated out of a station 6 blocks from our observation post. Their average response time was 7 minutes. I spent a week watching them. The systems coordination, the role switching under pressure, the way they communicated with minimum language because they had worked together long enough that the minimum was sufficient, it looked less like a professional service and more like a single distributed organism making fast decisions. The school 2 streets over. I spent 4 days on the school. Not because it was militarily relevant, it wasn't. Because of the teacher. Middle-aged, visibly tired in the specific way that people who work too hard and care too much get tired. She was teaching children something from their history, Warsaw's history, the rubble and the rebuilding. And she was not teaching it the way you teach data. She was teaching it the way you teach something that will be needed. Like she was handing them a tool. I watched 12 humans across 12 contexts and what I found in all of them was this. This particular quality of operating as if the world required them to be completely present in it. Not exceptional in one domain. Present across all of them. Maintaining relationships, maintaining skills, maintaining the specific knowledge of specific other people that forms the connective tissue of a community. 8 billion of them. I wrote a new addendum. It was 63 pages. I titled it Cross-Sample Behavioral Analysis, Emergent Properties of Distributed Social Investment. I sent it to command with a cover note that said, as professionally as I could manage, per Protocol 7.2, cross-sample verification is enclosed. Recommend immediate suspension of displacement threshold review pending full reclassification. Command took 11 hours to respond. The response said, cross-sample addendum under review. Note that emergent social investment patterns do not constitute defense or threat indicators under current classification criteria. Reclassification requires documentation of demonstrated capacity for collective organized resistance at scale. Current documentation does not meet this threshold. I read that message in the supply closet. It was late. The coffee had gone cold and I didn't fix it. Demonstrated capacity for collective organized resistance at scale. I looked at the Warsaw history files. I looked at the photographs of the rebuilding. I looked at the school and the teacher with her particular tired way of handing history to children like it was something they would need. Then, I looked at Pref, who was watching me with the expression he had when he was not putting something in the log. They want resistance documentation, I said. I know, he said. I'm not going to create a situation that generates that documentation. I know that too. But, if command accelerates the resource extraction review before the reclassification, I know, Pref said. Just that. Twice. We sat with that for a while. Then, Sevi spoke from the corner. She had been so quiet I had almost forgotten she was there. Assessor Solaris, she said. I want to note, for the record, that what I'm about to say is outside my job function and I'm saying it anyway. I nodded. You've been building a case to protect them, she said. And, command keeps moving the requirements. They're not going to let you build a case that works. The requirements will keep moving until the extraction timeline is met. She paused. So maybe the case we need isn't the one we file with command. I looked at her. She held the look steady. The compact has public interest disclosure mechanisms, she said. For assessments where population displacement is under consideration. It requires a formal protest flag from a serving officer. It triggers an independent review board. Command can't dismiss it unilaterally. The room was very quiet. That's a career action, I said. Yes. If the independent review agrees with Command's classification, the flag goes in my permanent record as unsupported intervention. Yes. And, if they agree with my findings, Command's accelerated timeline gets suspended pending the review process, which takes 18 to 24 months, she said. Minimum. I drank my cold coffee. It tasted terrible. That seemed appropriate. It also, I said slowly, requires that the protest flag be accompanied by evidence that directly demonstrates what Command's own criteria say they need. Collective organized resistance capacity. Sevi didn't say anything. I looked at the wall. I'm not, I said again, going to create a situation that generates that evidence. No, Sevi agreed. You're not. A pause. But, she said, the situation might be about to create itself. She was right. She was infuriatingly, precisely right. On the 50th day of a 30-day assessment that Command wanted concluded, we received an alert through the passive surveillance network that should not have been possible, because the network was masked and operating on encrypted compact frequencies, and there was no mechanism by which Earth's indigenous communication infrastructure should have been able to interface with it. The alert was a single word, in the local language, which Sevi translated without being asked. The word was, found. A location tag was attached. The location was our supply closet. I sat very still for approximately 4 seconds. Then, Ro, from the console, said in the tone he reserved for technical problems that were interesting rather than catastrophic, the masking signature. She's not finding us through optical or radio. She found the encryption lattice. The bird thing was about identifying pattern. She's been applying the same methodology to our communication signatures. A pause. She's been doing it for weeks. I stood up. How long have we been visible? At minimum, 12 days. 12 days. Subject 17 had known where we were for 12 days and had done nothing except continue observing us while we were observing her. The same way she had known about the first drone. The 9 days of patience. The 12 days, now, of letting us think we had the advantage. Preth said something under his breath that my translation kit rendered as an expression of profound existential frustration. She's not alone, Rose said, scanning the perimeter data. I'm reading movement. Multiple contact signatures, converging on this location. He looked up. She brought people. Preth looked at me. I looked at Sevi. Sevi looked at the wall. Collective organized resistance, she said quietly. At scale. I said something that my translation kit declined to render and, which I have therefore omitted from the official log. Then, I made a decision that was not in any assessment protocol I had ever studied, filed, or reviewed. I opened the supply closet door. And, I waited. 17 was the first through. She was shorter than I had expected. I don't know why I had expected otherwise. I had 400 pages of documentation on her, including physical profile data, but there is a difference between documented height and the height of a person who has just walked through your door after 12 days of knowing exactly where you were and choosing her moment. She was also, I noticed, armed. They were all armed, 6 of them, professional spacing, controlled entry, but that wasn't the thing I noticed first. What I noticed first was that she looked at me with an expression I needed Sevi to help me read later because my cultural interpretation training had not covered it precisely. It was not hostile. It was not afraid. It was the expression of someone who had suspected something specific for a long time and had just been proven correct. She looked at me like I was data that confirmed a hypothesis. We stood there, she and I and her 5 people and my 4 people in a Warsaw supply closet that smelled like coffee, and nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time but was probably 6 seconds. Then, 17 said something. Sevi translated in a murmur, "We've been watching you watch us." And, then, this is the part that I find hardest to explain and have tried to explain approximately 40 times in subsequent debriefs and have never done adequately. She put her weapon away. Not surrendering. Not backing down. The body language was not capitulation. It was an offer. I looked at her. She looked at me. I thought about the protest flag. I thought about 18 to 24 months. I thought about the teacher handing history to children like it was a tool they'd need. I put my own "I don't carry a weapon, I'm an assessor," but I had a containment device on my belt that I reached for and, set on the table, I put it down. And, I said, in the best approximation of the local language I had managed in 58 days of full-time observation, "I think we need to talk." 17 looked at the translation. Something crossed her face that Sevi, later, identified for me. It was the beginning of a slightly exhausted, slightly amused, extremely dangerous smile. "Yeah," 17 said. I figured. Assessor rank Ven Solaris, field log, active status cross-reference, Appendix D through Appendix Q classification, restricted, 3rd expansion arm, survey division note appended. The following log entries are being reviewed by the Independent Assessment Board, Public Interest Disclosure Track 7, Ref, UX 7734/Earth. Assessor Solaris's protest flag was filed on day 58. The review board has requested all documentation including this log. Command has requested that this log be sealed. Command's request has been denied. The documentation continues in Part 3. The Independent Assessment Board took 14 months to reach a decision. 14 months is not a long time by compact bureaucratic standards. My original assessment timeline had been 11 months for a single preliminary report. A full independent review encompassing a public interest protest, cross-reference documentation, and an upward reclassification challenge against Command's active resource extraction interest normally runs closer to 3 years. They moved fast. I have theories about why. I will get to them. But I want to describe the 14 months first, because the 14 months are the part the official documents don't capture correctly, and I have been asked, by the review board, by 3 separate institutional historians, and by Pref, who keeps asking in the way of someone who genuinely believes the story should be told right, to describe what it was actually like. What it was actually like was strange. Strange in ways I was not professionally equipped to process and am still, in the privacy of a supply closet with decent coffee, sorting through. 17th's name was Mara. I know this now. I knew it within the first hour of the first conversation in the closet, because when you sit down across a table from someone who has been conducting parallel surveillance on you for weeks and you both decide, without negotiating it, without agreeing to it explicitly, just looking at each other and recognizing the situation, that honesty is more useful than protocol, the first thing that happens is names. She told me hers. I told her mine. I watched her attempt the vowel arrangement of Ven Solaris and land somewhere in the vicinity, and something about the genuine effort she put into the approximation rearranged something in my internal category structure. She had brought 5 people. Not her entire unit. Unit 7 had 12 members. 5. The one she trusted most with something that had no protocol behind it and no guaranteed outcome. I thought about that choice. The selection process it implied. The judgment calls made quietly, without documentation, based on knowledge of individuals that couldn't be filed. I had written 63 pages about distributed social investment patterns, and here it was, in 5 people around a table, smaller and more specific and more real than my documentation had made it. Sevi did translation. She was excellent. She also had the useful quality of understanding when to translate precisely and when to translate the meaning, and she managed the calibration well, which is harder than it sounds and which I have only appreciated more as I've worked through the conversation in memory. The first thing Mara said, once the table was set and the coffee, was her contribution, and Ro made a sound that I believe was gratitude. She said, "You're not military." A statement, not a question. She had done her homework. Survey division, I said. Assessment. Assessment. She turned the word over. You're figuring out what we are. What you are from a compact classification perspective. Yes. And what are we? I had a 63-page addendum on that question. I also had a pending protest flag and an active command dispute and 14 months of review ahead of me. I had, technically, a professional obligation to not disclose assessment findings to subjects under observation. I said, more than the file said. She looked at me for a moment. Good, she said. Just that. And then, she picked up her coffee and waited for me to say more. What she knew, and how she knew it, took 3 conversations across 2 days to establish. The short version, they had been watching the compact's presence in the solar system for 11 years. Not the survey division specifically. They had detected anomalous activity in the outer system that they classified, internally, as possibly non-terrestrial. They had tracked it. They had built a picture of it, incomplete, partially wrong, but structurally sound, through a combination of passive observation, inferred communication pattern analysis, and, what Mara called, without irony, detective work. Detective work. Like it was a natural approach to a problem. They had known something was here. They had not known what specifically. When Mara had identified the first surveillance drone, the 9 days of counter-surveillance had not been instinctive. It had been the application of a framework her unit had developed over years for this exact contingency. They had a contingency plan. For alien contact. Not an official one. Not a government policy. A unit-level contingency, developed quietly, between 12 people who had looked at the data and decided that having a plan was better than not having one. I asked her how long the unit had been building it. She said, about 4 years. I asked her what the plan was, exactly. She said, find out what you want. Figure out if it's a problem. Respond accordingly. I said, that's not a very detailed plan. She said, most plans stop being detailed about 40 seconds in. The framework matters more. I thought about that for a long time. I want to be clear about something that I have been asked to clarify by the review board, by Command's legal division, and by Preth approximately a dozen times. I did not tell Mara about the resource extraction interest. I did not tell her about the population displacement threshold. I did not tell her about the 3 million figure. I did not tell her about the acceleration timeline or Command's responses to my addenda or the criteria they kept moving. What I told her was the shape of the situation. That there were assessment processes. That those processes had outcomes. That the outcomes were not yet determined. That I had filed documentation suggesting a different outcome than the one currently in motion. I told her, specifically, that the independent review process existed and that it was active. That the documentation I had filed would be reviewed by a board that was not Command. That the board had the authority to suspend extraction proceedings pending their findings. I told her that I believed the findings would go a certain way if the documentation was thorough. I told her that if there were things I had missed, things that belonged in the documentation, I wanted to know about them. She was very still while I said this. Not the stillness of someone processing information. The stillness of someone who has already processed and is now deciding. She said, "You're asking us to help you make the case." "I'm asking if there's a case I'm missing," I said. She looked at me. The look lasted long enough that Sevi shifted in her chair. "You have a file on us," Mara said. "What does it say?" I told her. Not everything, classified content, active assessment, professional constraints. But the shape. Primitive world. 43 pages. Negligible threat. 200 years of uncorrected assumption. She was quiet for a moment. Then, she said something that Sevi translated carefully, looking at me to make sure I understood the weight of it. "The thing you're missing isn't in the file. It's the thing the file is for. You don't classify a world to understand it. You classify it to decide what to do with it." I had no professional response to that. So I didn't give one. She continued, "What I want to know is, when you write your case, do you understand that we're not asking to be classified? We're asking to be left alone." I thought about Warsaw rebuilt from memory. About the teacher with her tired hands. About 3 million people on the wrong end of a pending designation. "Yes," I said. "I understand." The 14 months were not, predominantly, dramatic. That is important to say, because what you might expect from an alien contact scenario from a human soldier and a compact assessor locked in a supply closet in Warsaw is continuous high tension. Confrontation. Standoffs. The kind of narrative escalation that makes a clean story. What actually happened was, we worked. Mara brought documentation. Not what I expected, not military records or weapons inventories, not the kind of data that would have satisfied Command's resistance capacity criteria if I had wanted to go that route. What she brought was the other kind of evidence. Housing records from the post-war Reconstruction period. Population registries rebuilt by hand from photographs and neighbor testimony. A census of a city that had been destroyed, in which the humans had counted themselves from memory because the records were ash. She brought testimony archives. Not military after-action reports. Civilian testimony from the Reconstruction period. Recorded specifically, she explained, because the community had decided the forgetting would be worse than the telling. She brought community organization records. Neighborhood mutual aid networks. Informal supply chains that had operated during periods of official infrastructure failure, maintained not by institutional mandate but by sustained individual choice, the same choice, made by hundreds of people, quietly, every day, for years. This is what she thought was the case. Not the weapons. Not the strategic capacity, though she didn't pretend that wasn't also there. The case she thought I was missing was the architecture of the choice to persist. The 10,000 small decisions that added up to a city that had refused to stop being a city. I added approximately 200 pages to the documentation. Sevi cried once, reading through the testimony archives. She apologized for it. I told her not to. Rowe found, in the Community Aid Network records, a distributed supply logistics system so efficiently designed that he spent an afternoon reverse engineering it and, then, announced, in the flat tone he used when something had genuinely surprised him, that it was more elegantly organized than 3 compact systems he had worked on professionally. He said this as if it was a minor complaint. I noted it in the log. Pratt stopped noting what he thought shouldn't be documented and started noting everything. The hearing. I should describe the hearing, because people ask about it and the official transcript is accurate in content and missing almost everything important. The Independent Assessment Board convened in a formal session I attended remotely, as field assessors typically do, and the proceedings went through the standard structures. Documents entered. Criteria reviewed. Command's opposing argument presented by their legal division's representative, a very competent officer named Thubble who had clearly prepared thoroughly and whose fundamental problem was that I had 463 pages of documentation and she had 43. The moment I want to tell you about came during the criteria review section. Thubble argued that my documentation, while extensive, failed to meet the collective organized resistance at scale threshold that Command required for upward reclassification. That behavioral evidence, social investment data, and community resilience indicators were not equivalent to demonstrated military capacity. The review board chair, Senior Assessor Den, who I had met once at a professional conference 14 years ago and remembered as rigorously fair in the particular way that makes bureaucrats either excellent or infuriating depending on whether the rigor is on your side, asked the following question: Councillor Thubble, can you clarify the functional distinction Command is drawing between demonstrated military capacity and demonstrated capacity for organized collective survival under conditions of systematic threat? Thubble said that military capacity referred specifically to organized armed response. Den said, and the populations in Assessor Solaris's documentation that organized continuous civic reconstruction across 2 generations, under conditions of active systematic threat, using informal networks maintained entirely by sustained individual choice, that does not qualify? Thubble said that reconstruction activities were civilian in nature and did not constitute a military threat indicator. Den said, the criterion as written says collective organized resistance, not collective organized armed resistance. Can you show me where the word armed appears in the classification criteria? She could not. Because it doesn't. I have read that exchange 17 times. The board took 3 weeks to deliberate and issued a finding on the 241st day after the hearing. The finding ran to 60 pages. I read all of it, including the technical appendices, which is not something you always have to do but which I wanted to have done. I wanted to have read every word of the document that changed the classification of 8 billion people. The finding, Earth, designation UX 7734, reclassified from primitive world, non-contact to developing independent civilization, protected status. Protected status. The specific designation that prohibits extraction activities, population displacement, and non-consensual contact pending the civilization's own timeline to compact eligibility. The resource extraction interest was suspended indefinitely. Command filed an appeal. Standard procedure. The appeal process takes 2 years minimum and requires new evidence, which Command did not have, because my 463 pages had been extremely thorough. Preth had made sure of that. I sent Preth a message when I read the finding. They didn't move the criteria this time. He sent back, the criteria were always the same. We just finally showed them the right evidence. I thought about that. I thought about Mara in the closet with her testimony archives and her housing records. About the case she had believed would work, before I had told her what case I was building, because she had understood something I'd spent 2 months assembling data to prove. The humans knew what the file was for. I told Mara the result through Sevi, 3 days after the finding. We met in the same supply closet. The coffee was better. Mara had brought a different kind, a single origin variety from a specific region that I have since developed a strong opinion about, which is another way the humans have permanently altered my life. She read the translated summary. She was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, protected status. Yes. And, Command's appeal? Pending. But, the suspension holds during appeal. The review board's finding binds them for the duration. She nodded slowly. How long does the appeal take? 2 years minimum. More likely 4, given the documentation load. She nodded again. And, after the appeal? Assuming it fails, which I believe it will, based on the evidentiary record, Earth retains protected status until voluntary compact eligibility review, which you initiate on your timeline. She was quiet for a long time. I let her be. When she spoke again, it was not the question I expected. She said, "Why did you do it?" Not thank you. Not any of the transitional phrases that would have made the moment easy to file. Just the question, straight, looking at me with the same expression she had walked in with on day 58, hypothesis confirmed. I thought about what to say. I thought about the professional answer, assessment integrity, reclassification protocol, evidentiary standards. All true. All documented. I thought about the teacher and the testimony archives. I said, because the file was wrong. And, being the person who knew the file was wrong and didn't fix it seemed worse than the career implications of fixing it. She looked at me. That's a better reason than most, she said. I didn't have a response to that. So I drank my coffee. After a moment she said, not loudly, not dramatically, in the tone of someone finishing a thought they'd been working on for a while, "You know they'll try again." Not Command specifically. But, someone. Once the appeal is exhausted, they'll find another angle. Yes, I said. I know. So what happens then? I thought about protected status. I thought about the appeal timeline. I thought about 2 years, minimum, of Mara and Unit 7 and 8 billion people knowing exactly what the compact had tried to do, watching the appeal, waiting to see if the board held. I thought about 9 days of patience before shooting a drone out of the air. 12 days of letting us think we had the advantage. Then, I said slowly, they'll have had 4 years to prepare. The slightly exhausted, slightly amused, extremely dangerous smile. Smaller this time. Quieter. Yeah, she said. That was my thinking too. I am still in Warsaw. This is not standard. Field assessors conclude their assessment, file their documentation, and return to compact site administrative positions. The standard post-assessment protocol is a 3-month administrative review and, then, reassignment. I filed for extended field attachment on the grounds that the active appeal process requires ongoing documentation support. The board approved it. Command, notably, did not object. They are presumably calculating that my continued presence on Earth is better managed through bureaucratic tolerance than through the alternative, which would be having me available to the press offices of every non-aligned compact member state. They are correct about this calculation. I have thought about it. So I am still here. Preth is here. Sebi went back compact site, family reasons, legitimate. I sent her off with honest gratitude and a full recommendation package. Ro stayed. He is developing what he calls a comprehensive sensory profile of Warsaw's coffee market, and I have decided to count this as ongoing field documentation rather than whatever it actually is. I meet with Mara approximately once a week. Not officially, the protected status classification creates certain contact protocols, and our meetings exist in the operational gray zone that I have become increasingly comfortable inhabiting over the past 14 months. We drink coffee and she tells me things about Earth that I didn't put in the file and probably should have. And I tell her things about what's happening in the compact that she probably doesn't need to know and that I've decided she should anyway. She is preparing. Not obviously. Not in ways that would show up in a standard assessment. But I have 463 pages on Mara, and I know her patterns. She is preparing. I am not concerned about this. I am, and I want to be precise here, something closer to reassured. The humans preparing for the thing that is coming is better than the humans not knowing it's coming. My entire assessment argues this. My entire career now argues this. The compact labeled Earth a primitive world. They used 43 pages to do it, 11 minutes of flyby data, and the particular institutional arrogance of an organization that has classified so many worlds that the categories have stopped feeling like choices and started feeling like facts. I used 463 pages to argue otherwise. But the real argument, the one that actually changed the finding, wasn't mine. It was a teacher in Warsaw with tired hands, handing history to children who would need it. It was testimony archives maintained by people who had decided forgetting was worse than the telling. It was Mara in the pre-dawn dark, resetting to the start of an obstacle course for the 5th time, with no audience and no documentation and no reason except the specific human refusal to accept the ceiling someone else had put on what was possible. The file said negligible. The file was wrong. I keep it open on my secondary screen. Somebody should witness that. Assessor rank Ven Solaris, field log, active status current assignment, extended field documentation, UX 7734, Earth classification, public record released by order of Independent Assessment Board. Final note, Assessment Director Therick sent a message last week. It said, and I am quoting directly because there is a pleasing irony in it, I don't know whether to commend you or reassign you. I told him the coffee here was too good to leave. This is, if anything, an understatement. I will file a full sensory report at some point. Ro is helping. The appeal proceeds. The humans wait. The file remains open. I think they're ready. I don't think the compact is.